Hey, welcome back. And if you're new here, my name's Christina Kent, and I'm a full-time fine artist based in San Francisco. Now, if you've been drawing or painting or trying to make any art, or basically any creative thing at all, you've probably dealt a lot with the inner critic. There have been so many books and articles written on the inner critic that I think it's a universal experience, and I'd be honestly a little freaked out if I met someone who said that they never experienced it. And I think it's really interesting to look into why we have the inner critic and what it serves for us, but from a purely practical perspective, I want to be talking about some strategies that we can use to deal with the inner critic, because I think that if the inner critic runs rampant, and if you are stuck in a moment, say you're experiencing a lot of art block and you just can't make anything, chances are your inner critic is running wild and it's keeping you from making your work. Sometimes I want to make a painting, I want to make art, and I feel like I just can't. It feels like the inner critic has taken control and it stopped me in my tracks. So what do I do in those moments? And through working with therapists and reading about psychology, I learned some techniques that have been a game changer in how I deal with my inner critic. And that's mostly come from cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. From CBT, I learned that there's certain patterns of negative thinking that most of us share, and these they call cognitive distortions. And these negative thoughts are so common among people that they've actually created several different categories of cognitive distortions that usually, if you're having a negative thought about yourself when the inner critic is talking, you can usually categorize it into one of these specific distortions. And so there are a lot of different cognitive distortions, and you can look them up online, but in this video, I'm going to talk about the 3 cognitive distortions that are particularly bad and that particularly tend to come up with my inner critic. So the first cognitive distortion that my inner critic usually turns to is fortune telling. And this is when you're predicting future outcomes, usually in a negative way. So the way that this shows up in my art practice is that I'll go to start a painting and my inner critic will say, "Why do you even start? You know it's gonna be bad." And also, like, before I get too into this, I also want to keep in mind just how rude the inner critic is, at least my own, and how when I'm saying these things out loud, I think to myself, like, I would never talk this way to a friend or to someone I care about. So it's just kind of crazy that, like, we can talk this way to ourselves. But anyway, that's one thing that my inner critic usually says is I'll start a painting and it's like, yeah, why bother? You know it's going to be bad anyway. So when I notice this thought coming up, the first thing I do is I realize that what I'm doing is fortune telling. So I label it as this cognitive distortion. And then I ask myself, okay, is it true? And usually the fact that we call these cognitive distortions kind of implies that they're probably not true. In the case of fortune telling, it's pretty easy to debunk because I can say, well, I don't actually know if how do I know if this painting is going to be good or bad until I've actually finished it? I just started the painting, so I can't actually say if it's going to turn out good or if it's going to turn out bad. So oftentimes when I have this negative fortune telling thought, in the past I would let it stop me. I would think, oh yeah, you know, the painting's going to be bad, so I'm just not even going to bother. But now I actually like to challenge it. I say, oh, you think it's going to be bad? Well, let's do the painting and let's find out. Let's see if you're right. And of course, more times than not, when I actually do the painting, it turns out pretty nice. So then I have some evidence that I can use against my inner critic the next time it tries to make a similar claim. So that's my first big cognitive distortion, fortune telling. The second cognitive distortion that I often experience is overgeneralizing. That's taking a single negative event and seeing it as this overwhelming pattern of defeat. Something could happen only once and you start to expect that it's going to happen over and over and over again. And so how do I deal with this? Well, as with the first distortion, the first thing that I do is I listen to my inner critic and then I say, oh, this is overgeneralizing. So say I make a painting and it doesn't turn out the way I wanted. Oftentimes my inner critic will say, this painting is so bad, all of your paintings are bad, you're never going to make a good painting again, which gets into a little bit into fortune telling. But yeah, it's like I take this one negative painting and then I use that to predict the end of my career as a painter. Very dramatic, I know. So what do I do when this negative pattern of thinking comes up? Usually, I'll try to look for evidence to the contrary. So for me, that often means, well, let me look at the last 5 paintings that I did. How many of those, were all of those complete failures? Because sometimes if the last one was a failure, you feel like a failure. But if I actually look at the other paintings that I did recently, I'll see a few paintings that I actually really liked. So I can look at the evidence and tell myself, hey, just last week I did a painting that I really liked, so probably I'll be able to make another good painting in the future. I'll also look at the last time I made a really bad painting, and I'll think to myself, well, did that spell doom for my career? And no, I kept painting, I made more good work after that, and so I know that one bad painting doesn't mean the end of my career as an artist. So once I've examined the evidence, it's usually easy for me to say, okay, what I'm doing right now is overgeneralizing, it's a classic cognitive distortion, and now I can let it go and just keep making my work. The third cognitive distortion that often trips me up is all or nothing thinking. So the inner critic will tell me that a painting is either good or a painting is bad. Usually it just says the painting is bad. And when the inner critic is telling me a painting is bad, I feel depressed, I feel unmotivated, I feel kind of like I just want to throw in the towel and give up. And the distortion is, of course, that we don't live in a black and white world, but we live in a world with lots of grays, and I think art is the same way. When I think about it, I realize painting is not either good or bad, but it lies on the spectrum in between. So if my inner critic is labeling a painting as bad, I like to say, okay, let me find, maybe overall I feel like the painting was not as successful, but let me find one thing that I enjoyed about the painting. And it can be as small as saying, you know, that brushstroke there was really beautiful, very confident, and I loved how I placed it. Or I can say, hey, maybe I didn't like the brushstrokes, but the composition was working quite nice. Or the colors, maybe I tried something new with the colors and those worked really well together. And I think this way of thinking is especially helpful as you're learning to draw and learning to paint, because chances are your expectations are going to be so far, or your abilities will be so far from your aspirations. So it's so helpful to be able to look at what you're doing and focus on just incremental improvements, or the few things maybe, because when you're starting out, it can be very few, that you feel like you did really well in that piece, rather than just labeling as good or bad. So those are the big distortions that I usually hear from my inner critic: fortune telling, overgeneralization, and all or nothing thinking. And I hope by explaining my process of noticing these cognitive distortions and then figuring out ways to address them once they come up, I hope that that can help you in your own process if you're feeling blocked by the inner critic. And I don't know if it's helpful for you, but just for me, just knowing that we have these patterns of negative thinking, and they're so common, they're so universal that we've even made them into categories, for me that just is so helpful. Like, it prevents me from getting caught up in these negative thoughts, and it gives me some really helpful perspective on them. So those are just 3 common cognitive distortions. There are a lot more. There's a really great Wikipedia article that I'll link to that you can check it out if you're interested in learning more about this. So I hope you liked this video, I hope you found it helpful, and I hope this idea of cognitive distortions has given you some ideas of techniques that you can use if your inner critic is coming up. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, or also if you have any great tools that you like to use when dealing with your inner critic. And as always, a huge shout out to my supporters on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for supporting this channel and making these videos happen. If you like my art, if you like my videos, and you want to help me make more, check out my Patreon at the link. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.